Whether we are moving towards one global market or increasing protectionism will, in the long run, largely be determined by whether we are able to find political solutions to the distributional inequalities that arise from differences in welfare gains from trade.
If, for example, more powerful and wealthy players will be setting the rules that are favorable for them, attempts to build one global market with free trade will ultimately fail because less developed players will ultimately start having a feeling of resentment and will lose trust.
I do believe we're seeing a loss in trade and free markets. A lot of it is reflected through the growing wave of populism in Europe. I think behind that populism there are legitimate concerns, obviously. Nonetheless, I believe we together can tackle it, and I'm very optimistic about it.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here to talk about such a worthy subject. We're going to be talking about how to rebuild trust in trade. Obviously, as per the developments in Washington, D.C. last night, that is now a question that is $200 billion more expensive, potentially, with the more than doubling of those tariffs on Chinese goods that, of course, Professor Simon Evenett explained to us could have significant impacts, but also has further eroded faith in a system that, as you so clearly with data showed us wasn't necessarily working perfectly before anyway. Obviously, as you just heard from some of the students at St. Gallen, there are significant fears that this system hasn't been delivering for a number of people for some time. That has filtered through to the political domain, and it's become a much, much bigger problem than I think many of us realized if we were sitting on the stage here 5 years ago when things like the TTIP were in full swing. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our guests today. I'm delighted to say that we have a slightly extended panel so that we can get into the real nitty-gritty of this subject, and we can open up the floor to many of you in the audience who I'm sure are embarking upon new careers, run big businesses, and have big questions about how this burgeoning trade war is going to pan out for the world economy and for your individual businesses. So without further ado, let me introduce our guests. Of course, Professor Simon Evenett, who you just heard from before here from the University of St. Gallen. On my right, we have Arancha González, who's the Executive Director of the International Trade Center. We have Bogolo Kenewendo, who's the Minister of Investment, Trade and Industry for the Republic of Botswana, which you mentioned in your report. And last but not least, Martin Wolf, the Chief Economics Commentator of the Financial Times, who I presume will be writing about this particular development overnight in one of his columns soon. You heard it here first on stage. So let's start out with you, Professor Evenett, to continue your snippets, your little teaser there from your Global Trade Alert. This is a system that we knew wasn't working well before. It was fascinating to see in your report how already protectionist measures had been ushered in under the counter, if you like, for some time. And this, of course, has underpinned the friction between the United States and China, just at a time when China is expanding significantly with the Belt and Road Initiative, which isn't going to go away. So this new action from Washington overnight, the big question is, where's it going to end?
It is a very big question. The view I got from a lot of friends and analysts in Washington was, this is just a negotiating tactic, it will go away. But how many times have we heard that in the last 2 years, where that hasn't happened? And let's be clear, the US Trade Representative is on record saying that he doesn't want to unwind all this protectionism quickly. He wants to keep it there as a threat. So I think what we're looking at is a serious step backwards from a president who, in his heart, is a protectionist. I think he cares much more about how he's perceived in the United States than reforming the Chinese economy. And ultimately, if he believes this protectionism wins him votes, I fear it will be there for a long time.
This is part of the Donald Trump negotiating tactic. As a colleague of mine not so eloquently puts, knock them out first and then negotiate when they're flat on the ground. It's not just the modus operandi, it's the actual more than doubling of these tariffs. It's the schizophrenic trade policy here. Is that something that really concerns you when you look at the data and how the data will look in 5 years from now?
I think the answer has to be yes, because one of the things we do know from analysis of trade patterns is that it's extremely sensitive to uncertainty. And the schizophrenia creates that uncertainty. and it deters investments as well, and it slows down overseas expansion strategies of firms. They start thinking about serving the domestic market instead, unwinding supply chains. So I think, yes, it does worry me because schizophrenia creates uncertainty.
Arancha González, for an organization like yours, which is trying to promote international trade, you worked with Pascal Lamy at the WTO for about 8 years, at a time when the WTO was a very different organization that had a bit more weight than it has today. When you see this, as I said, this sort of sucker punch on the trade side, two of the world's biggest economies at loggerheads, how do you salvage the system?
Well, first I would want to put things in a little bit of a perspective. Otherwise, we risk having a bit of cabin fever, which is, I think, a lot of what's happening. When we diagnosed, if we were doctors, we would have to get the right diagnosis. And yes, we've got patients, if the WTO was a hospital, in this hospital you would have patients that have toothaches, patients that would come with an allergy rash, patients that would have broken a leg, and then you can have patients that have cancers.
Or hypochondria.
Sorry?
Or hypochondria.
Or hypochondria.
Very good.
Is this hypochondria on the part of the States?
Hypochondriac. What we have to do is not one by one makes five. 5 patients, yes, but the diseases are different. What we have today is a very localized sensitivity over international trade, which in reality is a sensitivity that doesn't relate to international trade, relates to an incapacity, in my view, at home to deal with the consequences of opening your markets, incapacity to deal with the consequences of technological progress, to deal with the consequences of digitalization of your economies, and an externalization of this inability that you have to the rest of the world. This is not to say that the trading system is perfect. It's not. The international trading system is not perfect. The World Trade Organization is not perfect, but it's the best imperfect systems that we have. And in my view, we should do everything we can to keep it, not to break it further, and if possible, to improve it.
Martin Wolf, is this about Donald Trump masking his own failure of domestic policy by distracting people with aggressive foreign trade policy?
There's so many huge issues here. First of all, I just want to park this. I think Simon's work has been an important contribution, but I disagree with a lot of it. So I think we should have the debate, because it's an important debate. He's done some very important work, but I am not don't reach the same conclusions, at least as I understand what he's doing, which might be a mistake. So we should have that discussion. So what are the issues raised specifically by US-China? So the following things are important. First, the US has a very long protectionist history. It only really ceased to be protectionist at all after the Second World War. And there is a very strong and in a way quite understandable view in the US, essentially that for us, trade is marginal. And it's pretty obvious why they would think that. They're bigger than anybody else, at least, and still are. And the second thing that is important about the US, and I think it's very special and terribly important because it's such a big player, is that it has an incredibly threadbare, ideologically underpinned threadbare safety net, social safety net. So historically, protectionist measures for these two reasons have always tended to play quite an important role in the discussion about how you handle difficulties in the economy. So the externalization, as you put it, is very characteristic in America. For smaller open economies, and all European economies are smaller and more open, that line of thinking is much more difficult to have, and the anti-trade bias correspondingly is at an ideological level is much weaker. The country in Europe that is closest ideologically, in my view, to the US is France. And the reason for that is it also was a huge self-sufficient superpower for a long time, which we should remember. All the other countries in Europe developed as trading powers. Very, very important. And finally, for that reason, given that a lot has gone wrong in the US, on a lot of fronts over a generation, made much worse than the financial crisis, they elected a president who is a committed protectionist. Simon made this point. It's very important. And I don't think, and this is one of the disagreements with Simon, I don't think this is some sort of small change on top of a generally unsatisfactory situation which it doesn't make much worse. I think it's a game changer, a complete game changer, that we have the president of the most important trading power, the creator of the system, the country that committed itself to this system, to create this system after the war, is a convinced protectionist is very important. Now, so they are externalizing. This is absolutely clear because blaming foreigners is a very attractive way of doing this. And he's even pretending, interestingly, that these tariffs are going to be paid by the Chinese, when in fact, of course, they're going to be paid by Americans. Now, I'll just make one final point, because there's so many other things to say, but I'm not at all surprised by where we are. I have no idea what will happen in the next few weeks, whether a deal will be signed or not. But and I've written this several times now, both unsigned and signed pieces, I'm absolutely certain that the trade dispute, which is not a trade dispute, but a geopolitical and geostrategic dispute between the US and China, cannot and will not be resolved whether or not they sign a deal. How it will develop from here will be affected by the deal, but it cannot be resolved on the basis of the negotiating position that the US has adopted, because China cannot and will not ever accede to it, one, and two, the US negotiating position is radically internally incoherent.
And diametrically opposed to the Chinese expansionist policies.
That is one, that is the relationship to China. One of the objectives, quite clearly, which is not a normal trade policy objective, is to stop China's development. The idea that China will accede to any demands that have that characteristic is obviously a complete fantasy. So, and that is one of the, now obviously that's not in the negotiating brief, but it's pretty obviously one of the demands. One of the intentions.
Mr. Kenewendo, we're going to be talking about developing countries and questions over whether this world trading system is biased towards developed countries in a moment. But I want to get your sense of how alarmed you feel when you, as a developing country, see two of the biggest trading partners around the world banding about these really aggressive terms that, of course, is presumably massively disappointing for smaller countries that have done as much as they can to try and grow from trade.
Yeah. First, I actually want to agree that this isn't necessarily an issue of trade. It's more about a race to the top, who will be number one, a battle of the giants, and really for the US to try to stop China's development, as was just said. And in the end, there is no end in sight. Because of that reason. And this is why, in the end, even China is working on the Belt and Road initiative and is expanding quite aggressively around the world. And for us, it is disappointing because we are preparing ourselves to play a very strong part in the global value chains, and we are preparing ourselves to feed into some of the largest markets in the world. And this battle, what it will eventually produce is a slowdown of global economic growth, and that usually drastically affects developing countries. As we have seen in 2008, the impact in our part of the world was very drastic because the little bit of trade that is done by the small traders, when it is taken away, it actually means poverty. It actually means real life changes. And I really like what you said earlier, Simon, that when there are big changes in the trading space, when there are big changes in SPS measures, it's not only an issue of this company is retrenching, it's actually a real life bread and butter issue.
You've often, in talks, we were talking offline beforehand, preparing for this session, and you've often talked about the bias in the system here and how developing economies that are smaller, like yours, feel that that they'll never be properly heard at the table at the WTO. This is happening just at a time when there's massive lack of confidence in the WTO system.
Yes.
So as you see this system fragmenting at the top, as countries like yours are trying to play a bigger role in it, where do you see it going? And your role in it, countries like yours?
So first, I also want to agree with that. This is not a new problem. There has been a growing lack of trust in the multilateral space, and particularly for the developing countries, because, I mean, the Doha Development Agenda was adopted a long time ago, and we're not seeing any progress in that. Instead, what we're seeing in the WTO is an introduction of new issues before we even deal with the core issues of development for developing countries. And like I said earlier, those core issues in relation to agriculture actually really affect drastically some of the lives that we're trying to change. And it takes us back to what it is that we're really trying to achieve in a multilateral space, other than for trade, but also geopolitical issues that we want to be able to move from heavily aid-reliant economies to being a trading economy. And when there is lack of trust, and when we are seeing this crumbling of the multilateral space, it essentially means that we won't be able to move away from aid-based economies to trade that are sustainable.
So practically, for a country like yours with an economy of, what, 14 billion and 2 million people.
2 million people.
And hopefully 14 billion and growing, potentially through trade, when you're seeing these massive fights taking place offline in the side rooms, and trade deals happening on a bilateral level as well, is that the future for a country like Botswana as well, to start thinking outside of this multilateral system, to also hedge your bets, to do deals potentially with countries like China, but on a bilateral basis?
Certainly. There is an increase of regional-based agreements, an increase of bilaterals, and yes, we have to hedge ourselves and ensure that we get the proper benefits. And there is more and more of calls domestically for us to even diversify our markets. You will, some of you will know that we've had a very strong focus on European economies, on the US. And what China is doing to grow its influence is, making it more attractive, facilitating trade, providing some of those trade facilitation financial support that the West isn't providing. So we are being pushed, even politically, domestically, to start looking to the Far East for market options as SPS issues rise in the West, as we're seeing new certificates that are very expensive for our farmers come up in the West, and in order for us to really ensure that we are able to continue exporting. So the rise of regional-based agreements is really a way for us. And then secondly, you would have noticed that in Africa we've been negotiating the AFCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, and when that comes to pass, we believe that it will also provide an opportunity for increased trade.
Professor Evenett, would you like to comment on that?
Well, I think for countries such as Botswana, you have to look beyond the developments in Geneva and ask what's going on regionally, and not within your region, but other regions. I mean, you've mentioned these points. Yes. These are classic. I perhaps would also add that there's much that countries can do internally to improve their infrastructure and trade facilitation, which also helps get goods in and out of developing countries. And I think that internal agenda is also really important as well.
Certainly. I agree with that. And it's why you would have noticed that a lot of countries, and in Botswana, we're working on simplifying and easing doing business and cross-border trade. And we're creating special economic zones in order to attract companies that want to work in the continent, want to benefit from lower wages, that want to benefit from more fiscal incentives. So we're putting several things in place, including infrastructure, in order to attract and be part of the global value chains.
We'll come back and talk about your country in particular and some of the ways in which you face tariff and non-tariff barriers in different sectors, because that's a really interesting dynamic in Botswana. But first I want to pause and see whether we can ask the audience this question, if you want to vote on it, on your apps. and I'll ask our panelists what they make of the results later on. In the context of slowing world trade growth, do you believe that A, we need to promote the international trade more strongly, that this could be an opportunity for relocalized economic clusters, or do you think that this isn't too dramatic and it'll rebound as it always has in the future? Full marks to anybody who wrote that question. I confess I didn't, but I know some of our panelists stand on different sides of this equation. I suspect answer A for you, Martin.
Yeah.
Which
Broadly.
would be, we need to promote international trade more strongly. Is this not flogging a dead horse, as we'd say in London?
Well, I think actually this is an interesting question. So one way of thinking about, I was thinking about this with Simon's presentation. There's so many different ways of thinking about this. But so is this glass half full or half empty? He's a really almost completely empty man. But let's say it's half empty. And I think it seems to me that it's half full, and that's the answer to you to your question. There's an incredible amount of world trade out there. Relative to world GDP, it has not shrunk. It has stopped growing. That's very important. On any measure that I know, the world economy as a whole, in terms of trade, in goods and services, is substantially more open than it has ever been in history, including, and this only happened relatively recently, and for me, relatively recently means the last 20 years, it has well surpassed what happened in the pre-First World War period. So, given that we know what happened between 1914 and 1945, and particularly in the 30s, it could be a hell of a sight worse. So that's very, very important.
I take that point, but there's many people in this room, to play devil's advocate, who are much younger than all of us sitting here on this panel, who aren't necessarily interested in looking that far back in history, for example.
Well, if they don't,
of
they
how
won't
much
know
worse
anything
it
about
could
the
get.
future.
Remember,
most of the history that I talked to happened before I was born. Believe it or not, something happened before I was born. And everything I understand is because I recognize that my life is part of a continuity of human history. So if we are really being told, and I can't believe for a moment it's true here, that there are people in the audience who think that what happened before they were born is of no relevance, then that would be very, very frightened.
The point I'm making, I suppose, is that when it comes to populist arguments, they're not going to go back as far as the interwar period and say, oh, well, it could be much worse. They're going to come up
it is relevant because for them, if you're Donald Trump, say you're a convinced protectionist, you probably think, it's actually never been clear with him, so his ideology is very confused, which is not hardly surprising. But he might well feel there's much too much trade and I should cut it. What I'm saying is I think we've gone through this massive shock of the financial crisis, to me, surprisingly well. Surprisingly well. We can disagree about how bad. Now we have to do much better. There are a lot of problems we have to deal with. The WTO is, I think, very problematic now. But, yes, of course, the core issue is a domestic political issue, which has already been mentioned, which is how you satisfy people who are losers, not necessarily from trade, but they're not going to be very fine-grained in their discussion of that, who are losers from economic change, that they will benefit from economic change, including trade changes. Now, since trade didn't cause most of those changes, dealing with trade won't satisfy them. That's where Trump's line is, of course, completely phony. But those who do want trade have to argue two things. One, trade didn't cause all your problems. It's very, very clear that it didn't. And two, we have other methods of dealing with all these problems, which will be much better for you. And obviously that's what pro-trade people have to argue.
Let's pit you against the audience on this one. We have the results of this poll, and I'm going to ask you, Arancha, González, where you stand on the subject. So I believe we can see the results of what people in the audience voted for. A reminder, the question was, in the context of slowing world trade growth, I believe Do we have the results? Well, while we wait for the results, Arancha, González, do you believe that it was that we needed to promote international trade policy more strongly? Answer A is Martin does, or that this is an opportunity for relocalized economic clusters, or basically it's not really that bad?
No, I'm clearly on the first one, but in addition to promoting international trade, we have to help countries put their houses in order.
Yes.
A big part of the problem will not be solved with trade policies, will not be solved with addressing the murky protectionism, will not be solved by fixing the WTO. It has to be an agenda to address inequalities at home. There is, and the line, if you wish, if you had to write a tweet, there is nothing inevitable in inequalities. Some countries are doing it right and some countries are doing it very wrong. So let me try to be a bit nice to the US president this time. He is right when he says there are lots of people that are suffering. He is right to have identified that there is a segment in America that has not benefited from globalization. The question is, how do we respond to these people? Do we respond to these people with the slogans, or do we respond to these people with action? So the more you do slogans, the more populism. The more you do results, the less you will have populism. Let me give you some figures. In the US, inequalities have the top 1%. The earnings of the top 1% has gone from 10% of income to 20% of income since 1980. This is only in the US. In Europe, this 10% remains today 11%. Let me give you another figure. The income of the bottom of the pyramid. In Canada, the wages of the bottom of the pyramid have significantly more increased, while in the US have stagnated or even diminished. The CEO pay in Japan is one fraction of CEO pay in America. The amount that is spent on active labor market policies, how much do countries spend on putting back into the job market those who lose their jobs? It's 2% of GDP in Denmark. Is 1% in Germany, 1.7% in Germany, is 1.4% in France, is 0.1% in America. Now, this is where this discussion has also to take place. It's not enough to talk trade. It's not enough to talk WTO. Please, by all means, talk trade, talk open markets, talk and do WTO, but fix inequalities at home. There is no way you can maintain support for openness if we contribute with this rising inequalities in some parts of the world. And I am afraid that the digital economy, which is what's powering the economy in the 21st century, is only going to accentuate these inequalities unless a discussion is held on setting minimum wages, on social safety nets, on healthcare benefits, on taxation, the elephant we haven't discussed about, and so on and so forth.
But these are politically toxic issues in places like the United States, where the US president has obviously taken what you are quantifying essentially as an enormous distraction tactic.
Yeah, but listen, lazy democracies, which is what this populism is about lazy democracies will just simply make this open economy and open societies collapse. So it's clear. Lazy democracies don't work. You've got to, I understand that it's more difficult to pass a healthcare bill than to impose tariffs on China, but the answer to your long-term problems will not be in imposing tariffs to China. It will be in fixing your healthcare problems.
I would actually... Yeah. I would really like to agree with what Arancha just said, because I believe that the overall issue that we should be addressing is how do we redistribute the benefits and the wealth created from liberalized trade. And that is actually the real issue in the US and around the world, where there's a rise of populistic policies, is how do you ensure that the losers in trade, they find some sort of benefit, that they benefit from the increased GDP growth, that they still can get healthcare cover, that they're able to send their kids to school and they're able to put something on the table. So how do you compensate the Midwest for what is happening around the world? And those questions, they also come back to us. And how do we ensure that our policies are creating a buffer, a sufficient buffer, socioeconomic buffer for those as we liberalize our economies?
Well, I'm so glad that you intervened, because out of all of us on the panel here, Minister Kenewendo, you're actually a member of government. Now, in many of our countries around here, it's politically toxic to, and I completely take your point, Arancha González, it's politically toxic, and I can tell you, spending some time on the factory floor and on the campaign trail among the people who are voting for some of these populist parties, to say you should look internally for the fixes to these problems. You don't understand the system. So how do we get this communication right for the benefits of global trade, as well as, of course, the reasons why that system may be failing that may have nothing to do with global trade and to do with domestic economic policy?
That is a very difficult question that we are also dealing with at the moment. So our economy is an import economy, and we have been heavily reliant on countries like South Africa for production. And now, more than ever, with an increase of unemployment, there's a strong call for us to close borders and produce everything internally. There are strong calls for us to impose local content policies and to ensure that some of the items that we've been importing are no longer allowed into Botswana. But I strongly believe that it is a balancing act. And when there is some accrued benefit of liberalized trade being felt on the ground, that we are part of a GVC, for example, then that balancing act will be able to compensate. But it also takes us back to some of the public goods that we're able to offer. If we continue being able to offer good health care and good education, and there are some jobs for graduates, then there can be some sort of a stabilized situation. But these are issues that will never go away, because we know what it is and what it means to be a closed economy. There's history on that, and we know it never ends well. There is no economy that closes up and thrives. But we have record that there are benefits to liberalizing, there are benefits to also controlling and ensuring that there is domestic production and jobs that are created.
Professor Evenett, that zero-sum trade line, it's awfully catchy, isn't it?
It is very catchy, but can I come back to the toxic politics which you mentioned? I mean, I'm with Arancha on the side of the diagnosis, and it works in social democratic countries, but it clearly won't work in the United States. Telling them to build a welfare state, they've chosen not to.
Post-Brexit Britain,
or possibly Britain as well. It hasn't worked. That argument just doesn't work. What instead they seem to respond to much more to is the notion that you need to get people into good jobs, and therefore you need private sector development, which is why on my list of things to do, the fourth one really directly targets that, because that is a message which resonates in countries who do or do not want to have welfare states. We have to show them how they can use openness to build their private sectors.
Yes.
Okay, and I think that's I think it's an absolutely critical message. Now, there's another side to the politics of this which has been a bit lost. And that is that because we will not deal with this open but heavily distorted world trading system, we are now losing the support of multinational corporations and firms who export a lot and invest a lot abroad. Let's just look at the change we've witnessed in Germany in the last 6 months, where the private sector there has gone from some degree of confidence in being able to compete with China to actually going along with a government policy of a new industrial policy, asking for handouts for batteries, subsidy support, and everything. So we are losing the large parts of the German private sector because we have not faced up to these trade distortions, and because some people for too long said the World Trade Organization was doing a great job. And this is, so in some sense, it's not just a matter of fixing the social welfare systems in countries, it's also reinforcing the constituency who supports a liberal trading order, and we are hurting that constituency every time we fail to tackle these big trade distortions.
Now, I know there's so much more we need to talk about, whether or not these trade wars are going to bleed into currency wars, as the United Nations warned recently, sector-specific dynamics, but we have half an hour for Q&A, which is a great luxury. And in the interest of being open, I would like to open the floor to some of you business leaders to comment on this particular subject. I'd ask you, of course, to keep your points brief so we can get as many as possible. Please clearly state your name and where you're from and who you're directing your question at. So does anybody want to raise their hand for a question on this hot topic? One at the back. Thank you very much, sir.
Good morning. I think world trade is always an exciting issue. I'm Pranjal Sharma from India. And tracked WTO for a long time. It seems to me that the South is creating its own trading framework. If I look at the developing markets, emerging markets, I think they are figuring out ways to do it, and Africa is a great example when you look at the fact that East African communities, SADC and others, are coming much closer together. You have similar trends happening in Asia as well. ASEAN is becoming stronger. So do you see that, and specifically for Arancha and Bogolo, that this is going to be the new WTO of sorts, and out of this collection of regional agencies would a new WTO arise, perhaps not called WTO?
Parallel systems.
First, yes, there is plenty of activity at the regional level. The African one is a great example. What's happening in Asia or in Latin America under the Pacific Alliance is very interesting. But this is not dealing with the hard stuff that is left to the WTO deal, meaning industrial subsidies, forced technology transferred, governance of state-owned enterprises, agricultural subsidies, fish subsidies, and the rest. Because you cannot deal with these issues at the regional or bilateral level. You need to do this at the global level. You don't reduce subsidies to agriculture only for certain chicken or for chicken coming from certain countries. You do this and you do this for everybody. You don't have rules that stop forcing tech transfer for a particular company. You do this across the board. This is why what lots of regions are doing is reaping the low-hanging fruits, if you wish, yes, of international trade by doing it regionally. And I applaud their efforts because they are going to, through that, create more efficient markets. But we still are left with the unfinished business that is in the hands of the World Trade Organization. I want to make here a point that sometimes gets lost in this discussion. The WTO has lots of things that don't work that need to be fixed. By the way, those that fix things in WTO are governments. The WTO is not an entity in itself. It's just basically the same guys that throw bricks at each other have to go back to Geneva and fix all these systemic issues. Exactly. But the WTO has also fixed a number of issues, and we should also recognize, as we criticize what doesn't work, we should all recognize, including businesses, should recognize what the WTO has done in these last 5 years. A deal to cut border procedures, red tape at the borders, in the order of reducing the cost of crossing borders by 12%. I don't think this is negligible. A deal to go to zero tariffs on IT products. Remember the digital economy. I don't think this is a small thing. We also have to recognize this, and we need businesses to also recognize this so that we give an incentive to governments to go back to the WTO to address the hard nuts that still need to be cracked.
Right. So I, like I said earlier, believe that we have to find a way of surviving and of making trade work for us. And RECs are one way of doing so. And but it's not a zero-sum game. It's not like you have the RECs and so the WTO will die. But the way I see it is that you have RECs and they become building blocks to a multilateral system that could potentially work. And for us to be looking elsewhere in the REC space or bilateral space, it's not necessarily to say that we do not believe in the multilateral space anymore. We still believe in the multilateral space. And this is why, and to Arancha's point, that there are several other issues that need to be dealt at a more global level rather than regional level that are still hanging. that we're still waiting for that implementation and seeing more progress on. And to take us back to that Doha development agenda, we're seeing a lot of subsidies still.
Now, you mentioned Doha. This is the second time you've mentioned
Yes.
Doha, those the round of trade talks that started back in 2001, and I believe you were Chief of Staff to Pascal Lamy at that time. Now, was that not the start of the end of the reputation of the WTO, the really public bruising match we saw? It was really painful to cover as a journalist. Then, of course, we saw some positive upwinds in Bali. When did the faith in, as you said, this is a platform for negotiation. When did the faith in that start to erode? Was it Doha?
I mean, maybe a bit of a disclaimer to start. I wasn't there in 2001. I joined in 2005. But that's a very small disclaimer. Doesn't solve doesn't solve the principle.
But the Doha trade round hasn't
issue.
finished.
Doesn't solve the principle issue.
It started in 2001. That's part of the problem. It hasn't finished.
Well, what the WTO tried to do, what members of the WTO tried to do in 2001 is to embark on an agenda to reform, adjust the WTO to the realities of 2001, which were not the realities of 95, date when the WTO was launched. And actually, in the agenda, they put things that today seem very natural, at that time seemed a bit too progressive, like competition, like investment facilitation, like government procurement, transparency, no corruption. And this was maybe a bit too much for the WTO at the time, got kicked off. Agenda was reduced to addressing subsidies, tariffs, important services. But what we saw in WTO is what we have seen in a lot of other areas of international cooperation, is in an inability to build consensus, not among members of the WTO, among the 5 members that are key to build the consensus in WTO. So it's not Bogolo and Botswana that have been blocking it. It's 5 economies that find it real hard to come to terms with the fact that today we live in a much more multipolar world. And I'm afraid, and on this I'm with Martin, that the problem is here to stay with us, finding consensus, to redistribute power when power is already being redistributed. It's going to be a little bit hard.
Let's take some more questions from the audience. I'm going to take them in chunks, which is great. So we've got 3. Let's start out with you from the right, and then you in the middle, if the microphone can travel along the line. Thanks.
Hello, hi. Thank you for having such a wonderful panel. My name is Shadi Kibati. I'm from Yemen, currently doing my undergraduate studies at Yale and spending some time at Cambridge. My question is to you, Martin. If we're looking at this sort of historical framework, looking at current developments, we look at very different cycles of unity and division, whether it's regulation and deregulation happening time and time again, whether that's with the formation of the EU and having like visionaries who wanted to put down these trade barriers, to what's currently happening with rising populism and people wanting to sort of put these barriers, and whether you're looking at the US and China. So 2 questions: what's new with what's happening currently? And second of all, will we have to wait, as history taught us, until it's too late before we start this reversal of policy? Thank you.
Now, there you go. That's a young person who's particularly interested in the period you were talking about. I'll let you answer that in a second, Martin, but there was another question next to you, and we'll take a few more afterwards.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. My name is Maurice from South Sudan. And looking at the issues that are happening in the world today, things to do with Brexit and the trade war between the United States and China, it occurs to me that that when Britain's power started to decline in Europe, it almost kind of started reneging on the promises of globalization. And when U.S. power it started declining on the global scale with the rise of China, it again started to renege on the promises of globalization and started intensifying the trade war. And these are the very countries that have a lot of influence in international organizations like IMF and certainly World Trade Organization, and they are the ones that actually are influencing the global agenda and the global trade. Should we be worried as developing countries about this trend?
I think, Martin, you can take both of those questions, can't you?
Yes,
Maybe.
I could
Please.
talk about. So the first question of the first part of this first question is what's new? Is that right? What's new? Do you have an hour? I think that's an incredibly interesting question. So if we compare the world today with that of slightly more than 100 years ago, I think there are some things that are really rather good. So let's cheer ourselves up. War among great powers. I have to follow the rule that nothing is inconceivable. There is no stupidity of which humanity is incapable. No stupidity. But there are no serious people, and this is very different from 100 years ago, no serious people, and I won't even mention some of the figures around, who think that a war among great powers is a good idea. It's a pretty big plus. So they have to solve their problems peacefully. That's a very important thing. Second, and really important, essentially, and this is, in a way, our discussion has shown this, every country in the world that I know quite a lot of them, having worked with this, is, to a greater or lesser extent, governed by people who understand, and if they don't understand it, they don't last that long, that their job is to improve the prosperity of their people. That's the aim of government. It's true for the West, it's true for China, it's true for India, it's true for the African countries. This is new. This wasn't true 150 years ago. I'll give you a long list of countries that didn't think that was the objective at all. And three, we know that trade has worked because we've tried the alternative. I was depressed with all these people who wanted regional self-sufficiency or whatever it was. Well, we tried self-sufficiency and it failed pretty comprehensively, and most people who seriously studied understand it. And finally, and this is part of where I disagree with Simon, we do have institutions that are better than having none. So I would argue, half full, we have contained protectionism far more than we would have done if there had been no WTO. So these are very positive differences. We have something to build on, and we understand what is at stake. Will that be enough? And that leads to your second question. Does it have to get worse before it gets better? I think it's quite possible. I think the Trump game has to be played out, and it probably will be pretty bad. I have a friend, I'm going to quote a friend who's directly relevant, who was chief economist at the GATT for many years, died 30 years ago. Jan Tumler was his name, very remarkable intellectual. And he used to tell me that, Martin, the thing you have to understand is that it's not true that we don't learn from history. We do, and then we forget. And why do we forget? Because we die and we're replaced by young people who, I'm told, don't care what happened 30 years ago. Well, if you don't care what happened 30 years ago, you're going to have a very, very bad world. Now, and obviously, what was the last segment?
The other question was if, say, for instance, the UK and the United States...
Okay, there's a broader question, which is perhaps fits with what was just said here. It is a reality that world trade policy, not success in world trade, quite a different matter. Very small countries have done sensationally in development of world trade, but the world trade framework is made by a relatively limited number of great powers. The big change, of course, is some of them are developing countries. China, in time India, will be in that game. They have to play a game together which stabilizes and supports the system. Clearly, the US doesn't want to do this anymore. I actually think no European country is committed to undermining the system in the way that the Trump administration clearly is. There's no doubt about it. So it's not Europe. But I think we do let China off the hook. China is a vast power. It is one of the world's three greatest trading powers. And this is where I find what Trump's position so maddening. There are legitimate complaints about China's role in the world. If we want, and it has to be global. China's a global power. It can't do it regionally. nor will India when it becomes a really global power. They have to commit themselves to making a global system work. And part of that is for China to realize that playing the game of, well, we're the biggest trading power in the world and soon being the biggest trade economy in the world, but we're a developing country so we can do whatever we like, that's crazy. So, yeah, the great powers matter. All the great powers matter. And some of them are new great powers. The old great powers are pretty bad too, but I think that we let the new great power off too easily.
How do we, sorry, just follow up on that point. If the WTO is as fragile as it is, where's the legal recourse for all of this going to go? Arancha González.
That's a good question.
So the only game in town, so this is where whatever is happening in WTO matters and should matter to all of you out there. The WTO is the only international framework that has a legal recourse, where if you have a complaint, you go there, you knock at the door, there is a procedure. The procedure is not show me your muscle. The procedure is what's your brainy argument, which makes a bit of a difference if you are not a great superpower, either past or future. So this legal system is today under threat. This legal system today is under threat because one member says that it ain't working properly and it has to be made work better. I guess better means better in our sense, close parentheses, but we don't know because they don't say. And the others are waiting. So I'm sorry, but if this is a legal system, it's the only legal system that exists in an international framework that has teeth, is the only recourse that you have where what matters is the brainy arguments and not the power, then it is also for the rest of the world to also stand up and work to make the system work. It's no use complaining. If you do not like what the great superpowers do, then the rest of the world also has a voice. I was in the Belt and Road Summit about 2 weeks ago. This was the second Belt and Road Summit. I had been to the first one, and in the first one, 2 years ago, it was all about infrastructure, 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 infrastructure. 2 years later, what the Chinese president said was slightly different. Okay, we've heard, we have to fight corruption, we need to ensure that this infrastructure is financially viable. We need to ensure there is a respect for international standards. We need to make sure that we let other international players also into the Belt and Road. So what do I mean by this? The president of China gave a sense that he had heard the criticism that during these 2 years had been spread not just by the West, but also by a lot of countries that have been beneficiaries of Belt and Road credits, by Pakistan, by Malaysia, by Sri Lanka, and he course correct. What do I mean by this is that we are also surrounded by people that are listening and are sensitive to the arguments and to the positions and to the posture and to the power of others. So please use it. Use it. If you care, this is the moment to care about the WTO, because if not, by the end of this year, the dispute settlement that this organization has will just simply collapse.
What happens, Professor Evenett, when there's no legal jurisdiction, no legal recourse?
Well, it's a bit like what's happening now. I mean, I would argue the system has already collapsed. Because the problem with bringing a case at the WTO, Nina, is if you and I were countries, we can only bring cases. None of these people can. Only governments can. So if you bring a case against me, I look around and see what you've been doing, and I'll bring a case against you.
Yeah.
Right? And once I've got the dirt on you and you've got the dirt on me, and after 10 years of protectionism, there's a hell of a lot of dirt out there. No one's going to be bringing cases in large numbers, which is why the system's being grossly underused in my sense. There's a deeper point here, and it goes a little bit to Arancha's and Martin's comments about the WTO. My sense is when you get into the practice of how the WTO actually works, I just don't understand the argument that people who want to defend and say that this has done anything to hold back protectionism or has done anything to hold the line. I just don't understand those arguments because when you get into the details, you realize the restraint isn't there. I think the really interesting question is, where is the restraint coming from and how can we build it up? And I suspect the answer is at the national level, where we have to win all those national arguments for openness. It's
Do you
not...
think the world could do without jurisdiction
Well, no,
over these trade deals?
Let's be clear.
If the current one
the world
isn't
that Arancha and Martin want is the world I want, right? The world that we have is, I think, a different one, right? And unfortunately, the world that we have is one where we are going to have sort of trade disputes settled by, as Arancha said, muscles rather than brains. I get that, and that's a massive step back.
As the trade minister of the country, what's your response to that? Is that an accurate depiction?
Right. So first, I want to bring us back to the point that many others have actually been undermining the multilateral system. It's not new, and it's not just the US. And to bring some numbers into this, the European Commission reported that farmers will see agricultural subsidies 2021 to 2027 of the figure of 365 billion euros. And this is something that we've been talking about since 2001, and they will only go down by 5%. And 365 billion euros is it's a very big GDP of several combined African countries and other Latin American countries put together. So that in itself is a very unfair and undermining of the multilateral system. And in light of this theme that we have today, Capital for Purpose, I think one can actually observe that there's the influence also of the financial capital sector in the form of subsidies that is being used first to undermine the system, but also to dominate the have-nots, really, and to really push out some of the new entrants or those that are trying to enter the multilateral trading system. And in the end, while we have to look elsewhere, like I said earlier, we still remain hopeful for a functional multilateral system. We want the WTO to perform its functions in order to deliver a more fair and open trade.
Very briefly, this is a massive impediment to diversification for commodities-heavy economies, isn't it?
Yes.
Botswana is an interesting case in point. One of your big exports is diamonds. I don't believe these types of commodity products attract these types of tariffs. And then, of course, farming is the other side where, of course, you're slapped with all these punitive measures.
Yes, I think when we speak to a value addition in several agricultural economies, you see that the multilateral trading system has actually failed them because it is easier to export raw materials versus exporting value-added products. And you see an incremental of tariffs the minute you start to add some value. I'll give you an example with Ghana, where I worked before I was Minister of Trade. When it's easier to export cocoa. But the minute they try to add value and make cocoa butter and make chocolate, then it's a threat to the Swiss chocolate sector. It's a threat to the Swiss chocolate sector, and it's a threat to this economy. Therefore, they have to face heavier penalties, heavier tariffs for the protection of this economy, and it is not benefiting the ones that actually have the raw materials. You still have them having I think the estimate is about 40% of the value remains in country, while 60% of the value is benefited outside the country that doesn't even have the raw materials. And that is something that we also have to face and talk about really how do we redistribute wealth internationally, globally, and if the multilateral system can assist us in achieving that.
Thank you, Minister Kenewendo. That is a fascinating insight that I think we'll probably all agree offers a tangible example that even here in Switzerland we can relate to, including chocolate aficionados like myself. Let's take some questions. If anybody's a Swiss chocolate maker in the audience, please feel free. I'll take some from the left of the room. The two gentlemen with their hands up, one after the other, and we'll take them in pairs. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. Kacper Staroszczyk. I come from Poland and study at HSG now. In the light of the battle of giants between Europe and China, what should be the role of, between US and China, what should be the role of Europe? and what kind of policies you would like to see implemented here.
Okay, thank you very much, Casper. And then there was a gentleman, I believe, nearby. Thanks.
Good morning, my name is Dominic, I'm from Switzerland. And pretty much following the question that was just asked as well, my question goes to Professor Simon Evenett, and thanks you very much for the contribution, very interesting. What's your advice to the Swiss and to the Swiss government in all this? It's interesting to see how the big boys play it out, but Switzerland also is in tough negotiations with the European Union. What's your advice there?
Okay, so 2 questions on Europe. Do you mind if I just start by asking Martin to take the first one on where Europe stands amid the fallout of US-China relations?
I'll try to do this very briefly. I think you asked was what should the role of Europe be? The actual role of Europe is to run away as fast as it possibly can. Which, by the way, I think is completely understandable. This is not a battle that one would... I think the problem is for Europe, but it's also the opportunity, is that Europe, and again, I don't want to go into all the different ways, Europe shares many of the concerns, the legitimate concerns, and there are legitimate concerns, along all the rubbish, that the US has about Chinese policies, which were, I think, perfectly acceptable 20 years ago, when you find it difficult to remember. China's economy, when it joined the WTO, was significantly smaller than Britain's. Today, it's one of the superpowers. So it's a completely different context. And therefore, the policies they pursue and how they do them have global repercussions, and a lot of them are problematic. And Europe largely shares those concerns, some of which, about market access, industrial policy, and intellectual property, are, in my view, legitimate. Not in necessarily the way they put it. The Americans put it, but they're legitimate. Europe should align with those objectives, ideally in a cooperative way. That's difficult. At the same time, the methods, and this is, again, obviously, the disagreement, the US, and this is a really important issue in Simon's work, the US methods are completely, totally, and comprehensively WTO illegal. They are, and I do think it makes a lot of difference whether you pretend to accept and live by the principles that your country is signed by, or you don't. And there's a difference between doing trade policy measures that are legal under the WTO, even though they're trade restrictive, from doing measures that are grotesquely illegal. So the EU has to say these are comprehensively illegal measures, and we absolutely don't support them. We think there are other ways to proceed with this discussion. This would be a very problematic position to be in, because you'll be fighting China on one side and the US on the other, and the result is, since you don't want to do those things, because this is basically, I think, what the EU feels, they run away.
Professor Evenett, the question on Switzerland?
Certainly. So on the broader global developments, not the EU negotiation, which is a difficult, different issue. On the broader question, when the world trading systems got into trouble in the past, it's often been the sort of very well-prepared, thoughtful middle powers who haven't, they don't get things done, but they put on the table great ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah. What I found quite depressing in the last sort of 2 years going through this, doing this work, is the number of times trade policy initiatives come forward where clearly the major powers haven't done their homework. So the steel excess capacity issue, which was pushed by Europe and Japan and the United States, when you got into the details, they hadn't really been checking where there was a problem, whether it spilled over into other countries. No one had done any serious work. And then you looked at this case collapsed quickly, as the Chinese quickly pointed out, when they subject it to scrutiny. Now, if the big players won't do their homework, the influential smaller, the medium-sized players who've got the time, the resources, the expertise, that is where they can step in. And we have seen the Canadians form the Ottawa Group, and that's just, I think, one. I think they've got a long way to go, but I think Switzerland could be fairly instrumental in putting on, working with groups of countries to start putting together proposals with proposals which will help take the discussion forward. And with the diversified Swiss economy that we have, I mean, this will probably also be very much in Switzerland's commercial interests as well.
So one final question from the middle of the room. This lady over there. If you keep your hand up, a microphone will come to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Mariana Castro from Brazil. I'd like to ask something to Simon. I'm very thankful for all the discussion on policy and the government level, but I'm also interested in thinking that in the past we've seen transnational corporations drafting agreements like the TRIPS, and today we see them mostly portrayed as victims or reactive players in the global trading system. And I wonder if you can let us know what their role is or should be in the trade war and the system as a whole.
You were doing great until you got to the end. You said is or should be. So this is one of these things. Martin's, do you have an hour? Because you could go into this one in great depth. I mean, it's true that in the past there have been some agreements where the multinational corporations have taken a leading role in drafting, and afterwards, I think governments have had some degree of buyer's regret, right? The intellectual property rights agreement at the WTO being one case in point for some countries. But I think on the other side, we have to see that these multinational corporations themselves have a lot of expertise, a lot of clout, and we want to keep them on board and on the team of people supporting a liberal trading order and globalization. And I fear we are losing them because they are not seeing governments stand up for the commercial interests. Okay, and that's that comes out very strongly in our data, and I can show you companies which are on record as saying they think governments have failed them. So I fear, I go back to the point I made earlier, we risk losing a lot of the support, corporate support for globalization precisely because we're not tackling these trade distortions that I described earlier.
We spent a lot of time, I'm conscious of sort of the risks to the system, but let's quickly end by asking all of our panelists how they think succinctly we could rebuild trust in the system. Martin.
I think that the best discussion of that was already given earlier in terms of domestic policy. Trade policy is basically let's be very clear, trade policy is an unbelievably economically and socially inefficient tax and spend policy. That's what it is. And it appears not to be so because the tax and spending are buried. And particularly the spending is buried. It's a tax on consumers which is remitted to producers of the goods in question. If we could make that clear, constantly make that clear, and make clear that there are much more efficient tax and spend policies which would deliver us from all these social problems, then we would make amazing progress. And many of the small open economies of the world have done that. Unfortunately, the big powers find it much more difficult to internalize this, and blaming foreigners is very easy, a very, very easy thing to do. So that, I think, is the single most important thing to do.
Arancha, González, I know you went into some of these points before, but...
So to me, trust starts by recognizing that there's nothing inevitable about inequalities, there's nothing inevitable about extreme poverty, there is nothing inevitable about citizens being disgruntled, that it's all about proper political management and investing in this political management. And today, there is nothing inevitable about the WTO losing its relevance and losing its teeth. It is just a question of political investment in making it work. So stop pretending that anything worse, anything bad that happens is the result of inevitable forces that we cannot master. Governments, civil society, citizens, businesses can work to make it work.
Mr. Kenewendo?
Well, thanks again. And I think that rebuilding trust here must start with us making sure that trade works for everyone, and that inclusive trade isn't just another slogan that we throw out there. and that we see that capital is truly for a purpose, and that it's developmental. And we need to restore the integrity of trade only by ensuring a fair and transparent and level playing field for all the members of the multilateral trading system, instead of focusing on the 5 that Arancha was talking about that end up stalling the whole process where we were supposed to get progress. And unless we address some of the developmental issues of the developing countries, we will always have a substantial part of this world being left behind. We will always have those that do not want to be a part of it, particularly those whose policy space is significantly eroded by both the WTO, the SAPs, and trust will always remain evasive in that region. And I want to end by giving a short example here in terms of SPS measures and SAPs and so forth. For some 3 years, we couldn't export one of our main products, beef, to the EU because of an abrupt change in the SPS measures that were not only expensive but were completely drawn out, and we saw a complete collapse of our beef industry that employs hundreds of thousands of people in the country. And for as long as those changes exist, even our constituents as politicians will lose trust in the multilateral system, and therefore it will continue to fail. We just need to ensure that the biases are removed and we are all equal participants in this multilateral space. Thanks.
And Professor Evenett?
So for me, it's very simple organizing principle, which is that we need to take actions which generate freedom from fear, whether it's fear of sort of old age, fear of losing your job, fear of not being able to retrain, whether it's an exporter who cannot export because of changing regulations. It is our inability to tackle these fears and uncertainties which is at the core of people turning inward and away from globalization, and that's what we must address.
I'd like to thank my guests for such a fascinating panel. Martin Moore from the Financial Times, Arancha González from the International Trade Centre, Minister Kenewendo from Botswana, thank you very much, and also Professor Simon Evenett. I'd like to announce that it's time for a coffee break, so please continue this interesting and vibrant discussion over coffee. We'll see you back at 10:45. Thank you very much.